I was very excited about when I went to Brazil in the 1980s. Brazil was very cutting edge. They opened up police stations just for women to talk about these domestic violence issues. Now Brazil has over 300 of them. In some cities they're working very, very well. And you have really committed police chiefs that are women, that are trained to work in these issues. However, across the board, it's sort of a stigma. If you get assigned to work in the women's police station, it's not as much of a career advancement. The women don't want to work there. They want to work in the big boys' police station kind of thing, so that their careers can keep going. So it's an interesting struggle to get women to acknowledge that working with women is important. And then it's the whole thing still going in. They're so overrun now, the Maria de Peña law. The irony of that is it makes the charges much more serious. And so women are now bringing criminal charges against their husbands, which could then break apart the family, and nothing is rehabilitative. If they go into the prisons in Brazil, as you saw yesterday, that's not going to help the situation. So it's sort of another example of the gap. Infant and maternal mortality rates have dropped considerably in the last 10 years. In 1994, the maternal mortality rate, which I looked at a lot while I was working with midwives, was 121 to 238 per thousand. It's a big vacillation in there. By 2004, it had gotten down to 74 per 1,000, and the World Health Organization standard, though, is somewhere between 6 and 20. So there's still a lot of work to go there. Infant mortality was at 25 to 26 per 1,000, and that's down to 16. And the World Health Organization holds normal is at about 10. So I saw in all the organizations that I worked with 3, Casa Aliança, the Alliance House, Colectivo Mulher Vida, the Women's Life Collective in Curumim, which is a Tupi-Guarani word meaning happy child. I keep in touch with them through photos and videos, and I've seen wonderful, throughout the last 9 years, they've all gotten much more funding and been able to reach out to many, many more people. And it's great to see the kids putting on weight and getting the women still meeting in their meetings, but one of the leaders told me that what they really started to rely on is just the pedagogy of love, because what the programs can do seem like such a drop in the bucket. And so they believe now that if you hug these kids and feed them and get them off the streets, that sooner or later they're going to realize that that should be their normal, not where they're living. And then you hope that in a generation, the paradigm shifts. But here's the thing that I was most excited about that's happened since Lula got into office. If you want to do anything for yourself or your kids in Brazil, you need to have your birth certificate and your papers. To get your birth certificate and your papers, you have to go to a notary public. Notary public positions are political appointments or rewards that are handed out and then held for generations with families. And they can be in big buildings, little carts on the side. What they don't have in Brazil, which was sort of instituted in the 1920s by state in the United States, is when you're born, you get registered in the hospital, and the state holds your birth record. In Brazil, in the Northeast, and now it's changing throughout the country, private notary publics hold your records, hold your notarial records. And if you want to get them, you have to get to that person and pay them a fee. So when your baby's born, you walk out of the hospital, your baby's not registered anywhere. So you've got to get the father to show up and the mother to show up, and they each have to pay a fee and fill out these papers to recognize that this baby was born. Some notaries say that the mother and the father have to have their papers in order to do that, or they can bring witnesses. It's just incredibly complicated and expensive. But if you want to sign up for school, if you want to get on the free milk lists, if you want to be on the regular hospital and open clinic availabilities, you have to have these papers. You can do it for free, but if you weren't registered by your mother to go to school because she didn't have your papers, how can you read the notices? So it's this vicious little circle. So in 2006, UNICEF and the federal government worked together to create a national campaign. And I think this is going to be a quiet revolution in Brazil. A national campaign to register children and their birth records. And the big success story was in the state of Maranhão. There 500,000 children go each year without getting registered. So in the state of Maranhão, there were a couple towns who were able to, in 1 year, with volunteers and social workers, go out and register every single child. And I really think that it's a small bureaucratic thing, but Brazil, if anything, is about bureaucracy, that will open up all kinds of doors. And I think it's pretty exciting between the laws that are happening and cracking away at the little teeny tiny bureaucratic steps that within another generation, I think Brazil will be a very, very different place, even from where Raphi spent time. Thank you.
Good morning. Well, one of the things that I don't have that these two have is a sense of perspective of Brazil pre-Lula. My first visit to Brazil was in 2002, but it was in the summer, it was in July, and his election was already pretty much a foregone conclusion. People were already dancing in the streets whenever he showed up. There were sort of impromptu rallies all the time. So what I know of pre-Lula Brazil, and Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the previous president, was at that point essentially a lame duck. So what I know about Brazil pre-Lula and about the change that Lula has effected relative to what came before him is mostly based on stories I've heard and not a lot of personal experience. But that said, the stories fly pretty fast and furious, so I have a bit of a sense. The story that I think most represented what Lula has done and the figure that he's become happened when I was in Boim, in that village in the Amazon, in probably early December. And it was a Wednesday night. The crisis was in full force, and we were sort of hearing about it, on the nightly news and through the rural radio station, which is the only thing that picks up in the village. But this was on a Wednesday night, and Wednesday nights are big TV nights in Brazil because the novela runs short, but it's usually a pretty important episode. And then there's a football game that starts up. So most of the country is watching TV. So between the novela and the football game, there's a special public service announcement from the president. And it's Lula sitting in his office looking more than a little smug and saying, I wanted to address the nation and talk to you about the economic crisis. When I was elected, everybody said that what we had to do was listen to the first world, was follow the example of the European powers in the United States. He sort of pauses and says, aren't you glad we didn't? He says, Christmas is coming up, they say, oh, the economy's in the tank and we're gonna go the same way that Europe and the United States did, and I wanted to tell you that if you wanna buy a refrigerator, you should. If you wanna buy a new car, you should. Brazil is not gonna go the way of the first world, because we know how to lead and we're gonna weather this crisis. I don't think anybody would have predicted that. When I was there in 2002, the real was skyrocketed. It went, I think, from $2.50 to $4 over the course of less than 2 months while I was there. And the predictions were that if Lula were to be elected, the currency would skyrocket again, they'd see out of control inflation, there would be another period where they went through a currency every year or worse, like in the late 80s. And that hasn't come true. In fact, the real has stabilized. I forgot to check on the rates this morning. It was down to below $2 for most of the time. The dollar was below 2 reais for most of the time that I was in Brazil. It was up as the crisis started taking off, but I think it's down to 190 something right now. Last I checked, it was 196, 197. So this wasn't what was supposed to happen, and certainly wasn't what Lula's opponents, who still in 2002 were out to paint him as a radical firebrand, were all about. But I think the point that that both Ann and Susan made about Lula in relation to the First World, in relation to the other leaders, can't be overemphasized. Both the major leaders of Brazil, and especially if you look at Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the previous president, in interviews, he's always going on about, well, his administration he wouldn't have liked to privatize so many state companies, but basic education is so bad, the Brazilian people are so ill-prepared that they don't have the capacity to run X, Y, or Z. But if you look at the other side in Latin America too, if you look at Hugo Chavez, I would say that he's based his rhetoric, at least, I can't speak for policy, but that he's based his rhetoric entirely around the United States. It's not around copying the United States, obviously. It's in contrast to contrasting himself and putting himself out there as the man who will stand up to Uncle Sam. But there is a model of Latin American leadership that relies on the First World, either to ape or to fight. And Lula has sort of said, we're not going to do either one. Lula has an incredible, what's called in Brazil, jogo da cintura, the game of the hips. He can meet with President Bush and make nice, and then go back to the States and go back to Brazil and make the kind of speech that got the sort of all the attention in earlier this year in February or March, when he said that the economic crisis was the fault of the blue-eyed bankers. Blue-eyed bankers, thank you, yeah. This was a huge, it sort of got a little bit of play internationally. It was a huge story domestically, because the mainstream media in Brazil is controlled by white people, some of whom probably have blue-eyed ancestors. So it was, oh my God, we're so racist. This came back to the race discussion that we were talking a little bit about last night. How can we have a president who says that, and blah, blah, blah. But beyond that, Lula has sort of held the first world at an arm's length and developed programs based on Brazil's necessities, I would say. And looking at the situation on the ground more than trying to ape the first world, to copy programs in the first world. And what he has copied, so you get into these weird things. His government has copied, for example, American-style affirmative action has begun to play out in federal universities, and I think state universities and public universities. So you have the weird situation of papers like Veja, which is the right-wing publication that everybody reads, sort of like Time. But it's pretty hard, right? They were the only publication that was consistently pro-Bush.